Good morning or afternoon, and welcome to our lesson on collectivization. So, what you should have in front of you before we start is a PowerPoint, which I've either sent to you or shared with you on collectivization, and 6 pages from a textbook which I've scanned and emailed to you, which deal with collectivization. But before that, it also deals with the 5-year plans. So read through that handout at some point. It'll help you when we're looking at the pros and cons of collectivization as well. And it will also help you quite a lot with 5-year plans, which is obviously quite a big part of the topic which we're doing, or the second file divider, if you want to call it that. So collectivization is what we're looking at. So you should have your PowerPoint open, and what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to talk you through that, and then there's a couple of things which I would like you to do. So collectivization has to be examined as at the same time as the 5-year plans. They're both about ultimately the same thing, which is about the modernization of the Soviet economy in Stalin's attempt to turn the Soviet Union into a modern nation which can challenge and eventually overtake the Western or capitalist powers. So why was collectivization introduced, first of all? Firstly, it has to be seen as a replacement to the new economic policy. And there were, quite frankly, elements of the new economic policy which were not communist. So, for example, the emergence of netmen, the emergence of a market economy. Netmen were individuals, were men who would go to the countryside, buy the grain off peasants, take that grain back to the cities, and then sell it for a profit. That went against everything communism stood for. So it was designed to root out the capitalist elements which remained within the old agricultural sector. Secondly, it would eliminate the kulaks. The kulaks were seen as the elite from the peasantry. They were seen as individuals who would never be able to reconcile themselves with communism. So they were seen ultimately as a class enemy, in the same way that old bourgeois managers, members of the aristocracy, members of the Russian Orthodox Church were seen as class enemies or enemies of communism. So collectivization was an opportunity to eliminate those people. Thirdly, it would make it easier for farms to mechanize, which would increase production. So if you have a tractor doing the work that previously a number of men or a number of women would do, it frees up the individuals who previously worked in agriculture, and they could move to cities and they could work in factories. So the mechanization, the use of farms, and this is done through motor tractor stations, this would enable the Soviet agricultural sector to become more productive. It would increase food production. It would ensure that cities were well fed, that workers were well fed, and it would also mean that it would free up workers who previously worked in agriculture to move to cities, which is what communism is all about. Also, it was hoped, so this is our fourth point, I guess, also it would be hoped that as Russian agriculture mechanized, as it became more productive, then there would be a grain surplus, so there would be grain which Russia would be able to sell on the international market. That would raise much needed capital, which they could then use to buy industrial machinery. So the fifth and final point, and this underpins everything about collectivization, I guess, is it would allow peasants to move to the cities, to become part of the industrial working class, and the industrial working class is the backbone of communism, so it would help communism in the long run. Okay, so our second point, the second issue we're going to look at, is how was collectivization introduced? So 1927, it is voluntary. So the Soviet Union wants to collectivize, but they want it to be done voluntarily. They want Russian peasants to enter collectivized farms of their own free will. So this was unsuccessful, and the reason it is unsuccessful is pretty logical. It's pretty obvious, really, when you look at it. Peasants were given their own land by Lenin in the land decree. That wasn't something that Lenin wanted to do, but it was something that Lenin felt he had to do because so many peasants were seizing land from the old landowners. Private property, private ownership is not compatible with communism. So it never made sense for communists to hand over the ownership of the land to the peasants. So collectivization is in part a way to, see their way past that, to go back to good old-fashioned communist values. So what collectivization meant to these peasants who did own their own land was they would no longer own it. So they are given this land in 1917. They're having it taken from them in the late 1920s. They didn't want to have that land taken from them. They had pride, and many of them felt that it was their right to own this land. For the state to say, you no longer own that land, that farm with many other farms are forming these collective farms, because that's what collective farms are ultimately. It's the grouping together of a number of individually owned plots of land or farms into one huge collective farm. Many members of the peasantry didn't want to do that, and we'll see what they did to protest against that at a later date. So in 1929, what Stalin does is he orders farmers to pool their land and to pool their resources into these collective farms. There were no other details about how this was to be done. Stalin wanted it to be voluntary for obvious reasons. He didn't want to be seen to coerce or force peasants onto these collective farms. But that is ultimately what he had to do. So the aim was for these kolkhoz to be established, these collective farms to be established, and they would be more efficient, they would be more effective, they would make better use of machinery, because it makes more sense to use machinery if you have a huge farm rather than doing things by hand, which you can do if you only have a small farm. And it would be hoped that it would modernise the Soviet agricultural sector. In 1930, there are the first problems. In 1930, Stalin issued an order that small plots were not to be socialised, and this led to many withdrawing from the collectives. So, as I mentioned, it was designed to eliminate the kulaks. The kulaks were peasants who owned their own land. They tended to be wealthier than other peasants, and they were disliked by the rest of the peasantry. And they were also disliked by the Communist Party as well. So this was taking their land off them, and this was placing them onto collective farms. This was putting their farms under the ownership of the collectives. So it was eliminating a class enemy. And they do that fairly successfully. About 6 million of them end up dying through forced collectivization, as we'll see. So despite the wishes that Stalin had for collectivization to be voluntary, ultimately, eventually, collectivization was forced on people from above. And it was done so with, it's probably becoming familiar with Stalin by now, it was done through the threat of force. So there were severe punishments for anybody, for any member of the peasantry who did not join a collective farm. So the rules on a collective farm were that 90% of everything that was produced on a collective, kolkhoz, went to the state. 10% was left to feed the collective. There was the creation of these motor tractor stations. Try to do more research on the motor tractor stations. I will send you some stuff through which will look at what they did. They would provide the machinery, they would provide tractors, other things. They also provided ideological indoctrination for many people who lived in the countrysides. The kulaks were deliberately destroyed, or they did deliberately destroy, rather, their farm animals, their crops, and as a result, for not just the kulaks, but many people who were forced onto these collective farms, destroying their own livestock, destroying their own crops because they did not want to hand it over to the state, it led to a famine. And in 1932 and 1933, there was a huge famine in the Ukraine, which may have killed up to 6 million people. The same time that that famine was going on, Stalin was selling grain internationally because he wanted to raise money for machinery. So hopefully that explains a few things. Email me if you have any questions. Read through the collectivization timeline, which is on the PowerPoint. And what I would like you to do is read pages 218 and 219 on the handout, which has been scanned and which has been sent to you, and fill in the successes and the failures table. On the PowerPoint, there are also 2 examination style questions. On the third slide, there is a part A question, so make sure you work your way through that. And on the final slide, there is a part B question. So if you could make your way through that, make your way through those 2 questions, put them on Google Docs, share with me once you've completed them, and I will mark them and I will get back to you with those, and I'll get back with you again and look at a little bit more of collectivization in the next few days. Take care of yourself. Bye bye.